My guest today is an accomplished, award-winning, and still rising journalist at one of America's most respected and important newspapers. And she got her start right here in Galesburg. A 2010 Galesburg High School graduate, Silvia Foster-Frau is a national investigative reporter for the Washington Post. As part of her investigative mission, she explores how local, state, and federal governments serve the country's diversifying population. Washington Post editors say she excels at telling complex stories that require rigorous reporting and sharp accountability instincts. Sylvia started her journalism journey as a student columnist right at the Register Mail here in Galesburg. And before joining the Post in February of 2021, she was an award-winning reporter covering immigration at the San Antonio Express-News. Sylvia, welcome to Galesburg in Focus.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great catching up. So you've had a big week this week.
I have, yes. I'm a little tired from it.
I bet. So I just wanted to make the record straight here. So my former boss, Tom Martin, kind of helped you get you in the business, but I played a small little role in your career because I was like a page designer and a web person. So I helped put your stories on the page and post those stories. So I get a little asterisk in your resume. So
thank you so much. I loved doing that when I was in high school.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute here. But let's start with your the most recent thing. You received a really impressive honor this week at last Saturday's White House Correspondent Dinner. You and three of your colleagues accepted the 2024 Katharine Graham Award for Courage and Accountability. And that was for your team's coverage of AR-15 style rifles in America and mass shootings. Kind of tell us about that coverage.
Yeah, so last year, me and a team of reporters, and actually an even bigger team of reporters, set about writing a whole series of stories about AR-15 style rifles and the role they play in mass shootings. They're the most commonly used weapon in the deadliest mass shootings in the country. And that I jumped into that because I had had some experience, unfortunately, in covering a lot of the mass shootings that we see around the country today. And I contributed a few stories to that series that were submitted to the award for the White House Correspondents Association. And yeah, we ended up winning it. And it was really special because Katharine Graham used to helm the Washington Post. And so it was an incredible honor and just an amazing experience being there at the dinner and, getting to shake President Biden's hand and Vice President Kamala Harris's hand and hear them kind of talk about the piece. It was very nice.
I'm sure. So, besides obviously it was a really prestigious award, but what were some of the things that stood out when you attending the White House Correspondents' Dinner? Who did you see? What did you get to do? What impressed you?
So there's a big reception ahead of the dinner with the Washington Post and then several other news organizations that they each kind of have their own receptions and people are mingling and moving between all of them. And they all bring guests. And some of them are more what we would call like DC kind of nerdy celebrities like politicians, senators, members of Congress, people in the administration, stuff like that. But there are some actual celebrity guests. So like Scarlett Johansson was there at the dinner. We spoke to her a little bit about our stories. John Hamm was there, said congratulations after the award. So there were also some kind of more Hollywood-esque celebrities. A few, not a lot, but a few that were there. And that was exciting for us too.
Yeah. Did you get to walk the red carpet too?
Yeah, they're the red carpet and you get to go and kind of take a photo in front of the White House correspondent, step and repeat. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I believe Lester Holt presented the award. So that's kind of a big deal. And then you did get to shake hands with President Biden and Vice President Harris. So what was that? Had you met either of those before?
Not like that. I think I've been in like a press conference call with President Biden. Never interacted with Kamala Harris and had never met Lester Holt either. So that was all very new. And we walked up, Lester Holt shook our hand and then we went on to President Biden and he said like how important our work was and kind of complimented us and shook our hand. And then we posed for a photo. And then as we were leaving, the vice president stood up and she kind of did the same thing, said that our work really mattered and that it was really important. And so, yeah, it was very special. And, we're in front of, I think people said there were about 2,600 folks in that room. And
where was it held?
It was at the Washington Hilton in D.C. Yeah. And, that work was very mentally taxing and grueling and it published at the end of last year. So it was kind of nice to do something a little lighter hearted, and also just have a reason to elevate that issue again, and bring it to the forefront so many months after publication.
Yeah. Any nerves going into that event that night?
Oh, all the nerves, yeah. And when we went backstage, like they were trying to explain to us, we didn't know what we were going to be doing. All the awardees were there backstage, and they were kind of trying to explain to us, you walk out, you shake hands, and then we're like, do we turn around? Do we keep going? And then they were like, oh, Lester Holt's presenting. And we didn't even know that. We're like, Lester Holt. And it turned out he was right behind us. And so then we're like, oh, Lester Holt. We started talking to him. And then the stage crew kind of got annoyed with us. And they're like, hey, you need to focus on what you need to be doing on stage, because we were very distracted by the fact that Lester Holt was like standing right behind us.
Yeah. So then was there like an after party or event or anything like that?
Yeah, there were a couple after parties. Yeah, there was a big Time magazine party, and then NBC had one too. And really, it's interesting. I didn't know this before I moved to DC, but that whole weekend is full of parties from different organizations and news outlets kind of surrounding the White House Correspondents' Weekend and based on this theme of the First Amendment and stuff like that. And so Thursday and Friday, there were like several different events from different organizations in this area.
Okay. So the term is kind of self-explanatory, but kind of explain what an investigative reporter is.
So it's a new role for me. I just got the official title beginning of this year, but basically you get to spend a lot more time on stories, and you get to really dig into them. And so sometimes that's making open records requests. Other times that's just spending a lot of time researching topics, reading books on it. And I'm going to the places that you're reporting on and just going very in depth into the history and the issue at hand of what you're doing. A lot of times too, investigative reporting has what we call like an accountability angle. So you're kind of holding an entity in power accountable for what they're doing or ways they may be disservicing the public, for example.
What's kind of the mission of the investigative team?
I think there's different missions. They all kind of, operate under that umbrella of investigative, but, there's political investigative reporters that, focus on President Biden or former President Trump or, some of these bigger, the DNC, the RNC. There's like me, who I'm a national investigative reporter. So I look at kind of issues out in the country. And my focus is really on how, as you kind of mentioned in the intro, how the government is serving or not serving vulnerable populations and communities of color. And so I really kind of look at places in the country where that may not be the case, and kind of showing disparities or inequalities throughout the country.
Okay. So obviously you're on an investigative team. So how many stories do you do just by yourself, or are you always contributing to a team project?
A great question. It really varies. So I did a story earlier this year with my colleague Beth Reinhardt on the NRA, kind of continuing my line of coverage on guns and mass shootings. But my last story that I did was based in New Mexico, and it was just me. It was a story kind of that I found and pitched and went forward with. So it can really depend.
Okay. What piqued your interest in journalism? When did you first kind of get interested in it?
Well, my first experience, as you mentioned, was with the Galesburg Register-Mail. And I think growing up, I had always had a curiosity and love of people and getting to know people and finding out what was different about them. And I also always loved to read and write. Like English class in school was always my favorite, and I was good at it and very proud of it. And so that was like a through line kind of throughout my life as a skill set that I had. And I
Did you read newspapers did you read newspapers, or were you like a connoisseur of news?
I wouldn't say a connoisseur of news. No, I wasn't someone who was like constantly reading like politics or anything like that. But my parents did get the Register Mail. And so that was always like lying out on the table and in our back porch. And we would pick it up and read certain aspects of it or see what events were going around town. So it definitely wasn't like completely foreign to me. Like we had this newspaper that was in our lives every day.
Yeah. Kind of talk about what was the column like that you wrote when you were in high school?
So it was an education column technically, but I think I took some liberties in it when I was writing, because I also wrote about like my cat and the Humane Society. I was a volunteer at the Humane Society. but I also wrote about being in choir and cross country. I remember my choir one in particular, I was debating like choir versus band, which was kind of like a rivalry in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of going through how like choir didn't get enough credit the way band did. And my brother was in band, so it may have been rooted in sibling rivalry. But yeah, so it really like had a wide range. And what I remember particularly loving about it is that at that time I also worked at what was once known as Uncle Billy's Bakery, that is now the Carriage House.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a strong intersection between the people who went to Uncle Billy's Bakery and the people who read the Register Mail. And so when I was working the register and stuff, like I would get feedback from people about my columns, like they would read it and like say things about it. So I think that was kind of my first exposure to like writing something and putting it out there and then hearing back from the public about it to you, which is an important part of it.
Right. Did you take any journalism classes or work for the budget when you were in high school?
I think I was a copy editor with the budget at a certain point. And along with that, I took one journalism class. I'm pretty sure it was journalism. It was like a writing course at Galesburg High School. Yeah.
Okay. This is Jay Redfern. I'm talking to Galesburg native Silvia Foster-Frau, an award-winning investigative reporter at the Washington Post. So after GHS, I think you took a year off before going to college. Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so while I was at GHS, we had a foreign exchange student stay at our home for a few months. She was from Thailand, and it was through the Rotary Club. And my family kind of got the idea and realized that the Rotary Club would like offer scholarships for students to go on exchange for a year. And we had such an experience with her, Salmo. We're actually like still social media friends to this day, that I looked into it myself and ended up applying, and I got the scholarship, and I lived in Mexico for a year before I went on to Grinnell College.
Okay. And I think I've read that that was kind of a really important year for you. You kind of learned a lot during that time.
I did. And I continued to write for the Register Mail during that time.
I remember that.
About my experiences there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you end up at Grinnell, but I don't think you took any journalism classes there. Kind of talk about what your path was at Grinnell.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of cases with liberal arts schools, there wasn't like a journalism track or degree. I was an English major, and I was really interested in creative writing and fiction writing and stuff like that. So I took a lot of creative writing courses and literature courses, and I really got a lot of my journalism experience from extracurriculars. And I tend to encourage people who are at liberal arts schools where they don't have that like specific journalism track to do that. And so for me, my sophomore year, I applied and got an internship to Minnesota Public Radio. And that was my first exposure to like a real being an intern in a newsroom, like reporting as an intern and producing audio segments. It was over the summer. They had like a stipend so I could live there in the Twin Cities. Mm-hmm. And I loved it. I loved like every part of it. And it was really that moment after I got done with that internship, I was just kind of like on a high from the whole experience. And I was like, oh, I need to find other ways to do this, And so I eventually became editor of the magazine Grinnell Review. And I did a semester in Chicago where I freelanced and interned at a bilingual newspaper there. So I started kind of trying to cobble together these other ways of entering myself into that field.
Okay. Kind of talk us through your professional journalism resume before you arrived at the Post. Kind of what were some of the stops you had along the way?
So my first stop was working for Greenwich Time in Greenwich, Connecticut, which for those who don't know, it's a very wealthy area in southern Connecticut, kind of New York suburbs. I had a bit of a culture shock going there. I drove my car from Iowa, from Grinnell College, up all the way to Connecticut, and got my first start as just like a general assignment reporter there. And I like went to polo matches and like wrote about new businesses opening and just things about town. And I always kind of had a interest in covering vulnerable communities and doing kind of social services type reporting. And so I tried to do that when I could there. And I hopped around to Connecticut a little bit. This was all actually, I should back up and say this was also part of a Hearst fellowship. So the Hearst Corporation, which owns many newspapers, had the 2-year fellowship. And I got that my senior year of college. So the first one was there in Connecticut. And then the second one was in San Antonio. And in San Antonio, I really wanted to be an immigration reporter. And I was assigned to be an education reporter through the fellowship. And I basically did like anything I could to show my skill set in that. So
why were you so interested in immigration?
I'm half Puerto Rican, and my family, both of my parents speak Spanish fluently. And I think I always had an interest in race and identity issues and kind of growing up between cultures. And so immigration felt like it dealt with a lot of that. And I think also my time in Mexico and seeing kind of the whole immigration discussion from the other side of the border, like I found very fascinating. And so all of that like came together in a weird way where I was like, oh, I was very fascinated with the subject and cared a lot about it. And so I kind of angled any way I could to get that job. And I eventually did. And I stayed in San Antonio overall for like 4.5 years before I got the job and moved to Washington, D.C., where I am now.
Okay. Kind of sticking on San Antonio just for a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So you covered some major events there, I think. A hurricane and mass shootings. And I mean, so there wasn't any shortage of things to cover when you were there.
Oh, lots of news happening in Texas. Yeah, that kind of a through line of my reporting alongside immigration started with mass shooting coverage because I wrote about the Sutherland Springs mass shooting. I was actually on like a breaking news day like shift on a Sunday and got the call about an active shooter in this town like 45 minutes away from San Antonio, and was dispatched there immediately and came upon like this horrible scene. What we would eventually discover was this mass shooting where 26 people were killed in a very small church there. And from there, I basically never stopped covering that community for over a year.
Yeah, I think I read where you kind of embedded in the community and for a whole year told stories about that.
Yeah, I grew very close to them and their stories, and I really wanted to be able to tell and really show the effects of these kinds of tragedies long term. There's so much coverage, obviously. There's a lot of national media, including the Washington Post, like there in those first few days and weeks. Mm-hmm. But 6 months out, a year later, 2 years later, not so much. And so as a local reporter, I felt very fortunate that I could provide that kind of coverage to the community.
Okay. So you moved to the Washington Post in 2021. Kind of talk about how you landed in D.C.
Yeah, so it was 2020, actually, after the George Floyd protests, which I was also covering there in San Antonio, that the Post rolled out this position of multiculturalism reporter. And it immediately seemed kind of like a dream job. And I applied, and I reached out to a contact I had through the Hispanic Journalism Association, let them know I had applied. And there was a very long application process. There was one day, and this was now during the pandemic. So normally they fly you out. Like once you get to the kind of final rounds, they fly you out. You stay at the hotel. They show you. I didn't get any of that. And I was like in my house, like putting on a blazer on top and going to my living room. And they had like a full day's worth of back-to-back interviews, including with Marty Barron at the end, which was very exciting. And then, I ended up getting the job, and I moved in the summer of 2021 to DC.
Okay. So obviously news happens everywhere, from here in Galesburg to Chicago to New York, but is there a better place in the country to cover news than DC?
I think it's all about what kind of news you want to cover, right? I mean, Texas obviously has a ton of news coming out of it. And there was never a shortage of it there. If you're covering Congress or the White House, though, DC is kind of the place you have to be. But I think there's so many fascinating stories out in the country, in Galesburg and San Antonio and everywhere, like that still need to be told.
Yeah. Is there a story here in Galesburg? I mean, I'm sure you come back and you talk to, your parents here. I mean, is there a story in Galesburg that needs to be told?
Gosh, that's a great question. I had pitched a story once, but I was working on like 3 other stories. Never got around to fully making the case for the congressional race that was happening in the area. And because Galesburg has kind of had an interesting political history, switching from Trump to Biden, but then having like Democrats in Congress, like there's kind of some interesting dynamics there. So at one point I had pitched a story there, but it did not come to pass. Another kind of thing I saw kind of happening recently in Galesburg that I thought was really fascinating was this revival of the Mexican communities that used to work on the railroads there. Yeah, and throughout the Midwest, you know, the boxcar people, as it's dubbed in the documentary, you know, there are communities of Mexicans that have lived in the Midwest for generations in small towns, you know, which is not kind of typically when you think of Mexican Americans where they live and work. And I think that's fascinating and definitely worth a story.
Yeah. This is Jay Redford. I'm talking to Galesburg native Silvia Foster-Frau with the Washington Post. What do you consider the biggest story you ever covered? Can you narrow it down, or are there a couple, or what's some of the biggest ones?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't pick favorites, but, you know, when I was covering immigration, I broke some stories about the border wall planning to go through the National Butterfly Center that I still think about to this day. When I was covering Sutherland Springs, I did an in-depth story with the gunman's wife, who she shared 2 children with, and he killed relatives of hers and her whole community, and he was her husband, and sitting down with her and going through the very complicated emotions she felt as someone who was the father of her children but had created such devastation and killed so many people will always stick with me. And even this latest reporting on the AR-15 and the images that we had to see, and that some of which we published to show the devastation in some of the schools and churches in these mass shootings. That's another one that, you know, you can't unsee those things, and those will always stick with me.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you saw your column in print, and do you still get excited to see your byline?
I love seeing my byline. In fact, whenever I get a front page story in the Washington Post, I go to the grocery store so I can buy it from the rack.
I remember that a long, long time ago, way before you were around. But, you know, I was covering sports part-time before I started full-time at the Register Mail. And when we had Dave's bookstore downtown, and, you know, I would go down there, and it was an afternoon paper, and, you know, you just go down and say, hey, there's my name in the paper. It was always a good feeling.
It's so special. It really is.
Yeah. Was there a beat that you have covered that you didn't particularly enjoy? Not specifically, but a certain topic, you know, like government or education or anything like, was there anything that just said, no, this isn't really for me?
Well, one that I've avoided covering and will continue to avoid covering is sports, because I'm incredibly ignorant in the area of all, literally any kind of sport.
Except for cross country, right?
And so, that's the closest to a sport I've ever gotten, and so I've just avoided it because, God forbid someone discover how little I understand and know about the subjects.
So, you know, how has journalism changed in the 10 or so years that you've been a professional?
That's a great question. I mean, there do seem to be constantly evolving strategies within newsrooms with how to kind of evolve with the times that we're in. And so and along with that, obviously, my journalism trajectory has gone from very small papers to now working at the Washington Post. So that's very different in and of itself. But, you know, there was a time when they were asking us whenever we went out to live stream on Facebook videos of the event going on. Now, I don't think people are really asking reporters to also do that, which is kind of nice, because you were having to report and then also record on this thing.
We call that backpack journalist. I think, you know, you sort of carried a camera and a microphone and kind of a little bit of everything.
Yeah. And so that idea of needing to Facebook stream, and it was also horizontal. Now, the idea is if you take a video, you actually want it vertical because people are looking on their phones, stuff like that, right? That I think newsrooms are just constantly kind of trying to figure out what's the best way to reach people. And so with that means reporters are also changing what we have to do with that.
Yeah. Why do you think journalism and news reporting is so important? Why is it important that we maintain this?
Wow, what a big question. Well, I think journalism...
it's gotten kind of a bad rap, let's face it.
Yeah. I mean, journalism is so essential to our country's democracy. And I think that it's so important for all of us to inform ourselves about what's happening around us, to know what's going on in our government, to know what's happening in our schools, to know what's going on with the water that we're drinking and the air that we're breathing. And journalism can be a really important source of information for what's going on around you. And I think it can also connect people, right? Because when you read a really good story about a community you've never heard of or a person you've never heard of, but you can kind of feel the pain that they're going through and understand what it must be like to be in their shoes. I just think that's so important also in uniting us and understanding people who may seem different than you, but are going through a lot of the same experiences that you might be able to relate to.
What advice would you give somebody that's considering journalism for a career? Either a career or even going into it, in college?
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely try to be realistic that it's a hard business right now, and there have been lots of layoffs and a lot of instability in the industry. So you do want to make sure it's something that you're passionate about. But we really need good journalists, and we really need young and new minds who can connect with new audiences and explain things in different ways. And so, we also really need people to kind of take that risk and jump in and do something that they're passionate about.
Yeah. How do you see your career going forward?
Sure. I really love where I'm at right now, and it did feel a little strange when I got to the Post, because my goal kind of ever since I decided I want to be in journalism was to work at the Washington Post or the New York Times, and then you get there and you're like, okay, wait, now I got to figure out something else to shoot for.
Yeah.
I do really love where I am right now, and I want to keep pushing my journalistic strengths and weaknesses and boundaries and see what else I can do and continue to follow my passions. And I feel very lucky right now that I'm in a position where if I care a lot about a subject, I feel like there's a lot of flexibility and opportunity for me to pursue that.
Okay. Like many jobs, the life of a reporter is not 9 to 5. How difficult is it to balance work and life?
Yeah, that part's really hard because you can get calls at all hours if you're on a breaking news beat, or if it's whatever you're happening at the time, whatever you're covering at the time, something happens, you have to be at the beck and call of that news. And so it really is, it has been a challenge. And I think for most folks, it is a challenge to balance your life and make sure that you're not constantly working and constantly checking your phone and constantly, staying on top of a story. And so I always encourage young reporters to kind of start figuring out what their boundaries are too, and whether something can wait for the next day or not. But yeah, I mean, the one benefit of that with that flexibility is then you can usually, if you end up having to work for 10 days straight, your editors are usually pretty understanding about you taking a day off on a Tuesday when you finally come up for air,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's finish with a little rapid fire round. I'm going to say something and you give me your first thought, okay? So what's the most important attribute for a good reporter?
Curiosity.
Okay. When you're not working, you like to
play with my dog.
Okay. What's the dog's name?
Tony.
Okay.
Well, it's Antonio is the only.
Okay. How about most influential teacher or teachers growing up in Galesburg?
Maybe Miss Nichols, first grade.
Okay. Boy, that's going way back. Some of my best teachers were in grade school too. It's kind of amazing they leave such a impression that far back.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. If you weren't a journalist, you would be.
Is it too close to say a writer? Like a fiction writer?
Okay. Yeah, that's different than a report.
Or I would open my own bakery.
You mentioned that before.
Yeah, I love pastries and eating them, and I love bakeries.
What inspires you?
I think the people that I meet in my job and the stories they tell me, and people who come from very different backgrounds and overcome incredible challenges. I'm constantly amazed by other people.
Okay. I've read you're an admitted coffee addict. So what's your go-to drink, coffee drink?
Honestly, I try to just stick to drip and make it myself. But if I'm going out and getting coffee, I just love a cappuccino.
Okay. How about, other than family, you get to invite 4 people to dinner, living or not with us. Who's at the table?
Oh, I not to do this rapid fire.
I guess that's not really rapid fire, but
And it's no one that I'm related to at all.
yeah.
Okay. 4 people. Gosh, I don't know if I should go like the politician or celebrity route.
Might be a good dinner if you mix it up a little bit.
Let me think here. I think I would love to invite. I don't know if I can answer this one.
Okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I'm sure it'll come to you later on, so you can let me know later on.
Circle back.
Okay, yeah, circle back. That's one of my favorite terms. How about must-visit places when you're back home?
Ooh. I like going to cornucopia, innkeepers, where else? Jalisco's. Where else? Lake Story. Yeah, those are a few.
Okay. Finally, what's Galesburg mean to you?
Well, I love Galesburg. Galesburg is home to me, obviously, and whenever I get there, I have such fondness, especially for all the things that look like how they did when I was growing up, you know? The people there are so warm and kind, and I love that we can like go to the grocery store somewhere and see people that we know and talk to them. It's just like a very nice and special way. Like you always feel connected, you know, because there's always people that you see out and about that know you from like 4th grade or know your mom, you know, and worked with them or met your dad or like, and that's like, it gives you like a very strong sense of like you have a community there, you know, and a support network. And I love that about Galesburg, and I feel very special, especially being in the East Coast. I treasure that I grew up kind of in a smaller town in the Midwest, and I like hope that I carry that with me when I'm here.
Okay. That's Galesburg native Silvia Foster-Frau, an investigative reporter with the Washington Post. You've accomplished so much in your career so far, and I wish you the best going forward. And thank you for joining me on Galesburg in Focus.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.